More than 3 years after the UK voted to leave the European Union, the two sides have reached a tentative agreement on actually how to do it. Now Parliament must vote on this new Brexit deal, which could happen as soon as Saturday. That vote. Joining us now, Ted Bauman, senior research analyst and economist at Banyan Hill Publishing. Ted, great to see you as always. So Prime Minister Boris Johnson tweeting here the UK could leave the EU, quote, in 2 weeks' time. Is that plausible at this point?
Well, thanks for having me back. You said in your intro that the two sides had reached agreement, but unfortunately, having the Prime Minister agree something with the EU is very different from having the whole of the UK Parliament agree. And I absolutely do not see Parliament agreeing to this on Saturday. There's just no way that's going to happen.
Why is that?
Well, I think, first of all, essentially what the Prime Minister has done is, to use a rugby metaphor, British sport, is he's kicked the ball downfield to the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland. And he's basically said to them, I can't get Brexit across the goal line on my own, so you're going to have to take the political hit. And it essentially is what he's asking them to do, is to convince Unionist voters in Northern Ireland to support an agreement which goes against all the principles that Unionist parties in Northern Ireland have been running on for the last century, which is basically to allow Northern Ireland to be treated very differently for the rest of the United Kingdom. And they've already said they won't agree to it. So without DUP support, without Labour support, without Liberal Democrat support, and indeed without a majority in his own party, I don't see how the Prime Minister can get this done.
What challenges does he face when this deal goes to Parliament?
Well, I think the key thing is that he just doesn't have this unified support across the board for the deal that's on the table. And he's also generated a great deal of ill will, not least within his own party, having kicked out a number of people, long-term members of his own party, over this issue. And so he can't expect anybody to do him any favors. So I think what he's gambling on, and I think what the EU is gambling on, is that the threat of a no-deal Brexit is going to be enough to blackmail Parliament into voting yes. I don't think they're in the mood to be blackmailed by Boris Johnson.
And Boris Johnson finding himself in a position I don't think he ever would have thought he would find himself even three years ago, more than 3 years ago, when he started to push for Brexit here at this point. So what options has he got now at this point if Parliament on Saturday does not go his way?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that a Brexit is not Boris Johnson's main goal. Boris Johnson's main goal is what's good for him, and I think also in the long term to be able to cement a Tory majority in Parliament and to keep himself as Prime Minister. Brexit is just a tool to get there, and that's why I think he'd be very happy to see the result go either way, yes or no, because that forces the question of an election, and he thinks he can win it. So really, that's the goal for him, not so much to get Brexit done.
When the UK is officially out of the EU, whenever that is, when that does happen, what wider-ranging implications could this have? I mean, much of this, many would believe, has already been factored into the markets. So what more could possibly take place?
Well, I think they've been factored into the markets, yes and no. I mean, I think we see increasing volatility with the pound at the moment. But I think part of the issue is that we're not quite clear what it's going to do to parts of the European economy that have close linkages with, with the UK. For example, The Economist magazine ran a map a few months ago showing parts of Europe that had high exposure to European manufacturing value chains. And some parts of Europe could suffer quite significantly. And with Europe already not doing very well economically, struggling to get the economy going, struggling to get inflation up, this could have ramifications politically within the EU as well.
Yeah, I want to go back to the idea of this election that might happen, another referendum of sorts. Put the likelihood on that scenario, and then if that does happen, then the likelihood of a reversal of what happened in the summer of 2016.
Well, I think in some ways, I mentioned earlier that the EU was also, in a sense, using the threat of a no-deal Brexit to blackmail the British Parliament. But my sense is that, in fact, what they're doing is saying, look, either you guys vote for this agreement, or you tell us unreservedly that you want to have another referendum. And my guess is that if the Parliament votes against the deal, that will become the next option on the table. And at that point, the EU will have to agree to a further extension of the current situation in order to make that happen. And that's notwithstanding the fact that Claude Juncker said that they wouldn't do it. Some other EU leaders have said that's fake news. We will do it if we have to.
What's the likelihood of that?
At this point, I would say it's probably better than 50-50. I would say that the most likely outcome is that we will not get an agreement on Saturday. The EU will then make it known that it would rather see a second referendum, and that would become the default position of everyone. Whether the British political system can deliver that is another question, but I think really that is the most likely outcome at this point.
All right, Ted Bauman, who is the senior research analyst and economist at Banyan Hill Publishing, joining us here today. Thanks so much, Ted.
Pleasure. Always glad to be.